This is a project that I undertook as a retirement project. I figured it would be a relatively easy thing. I thought that it would all be out there and I could get in the car and pretty much drive to Connecticut along the route with my ancestors, or maybe make it interesting, take my bike. And there was very little out there. It's coming. So I took it upon myself to try to retrace this route. And what I thought would be a small project has turned into a large one. It's gone from a one-year or a one-time thing to probably going to be a decade or two. But most of the work that I've been doing you can find if you go to Google. We now have a new official verb to Google. So if you Google Old Connecticut Path, you'll find the website, the multiple YouTube videos, you'll find the Facebook listing, and you'll find it's all about me now. It was something that was an unintended consequence of this. I had some real reservations when I was first contacted by Deb about who are these people and the patriots and founders, or founders and patriots. So I did a little research to see if maybe, well, if you figure out what your group is about. And then when I found out, I said, well, I better check and see if I qualify. And I did find it was a little confusing for me reading the directions that grandmother's father's mother kind of thing got me. But I did find that going back through my father's side, two people gave a lot of connections to the founders, my paternal grandparents, Irwin Newton and Lydia Dimmick. And when I was growing up, I didn't understand a lot, and I'm still learning. But I was told when I was growing up that the relationship I needed to understand was that Dad's father's mother married Dad's mother's father. Now, if you want a diagram, and it took me a lot of years to figure this out, that my grandparents were really stepbrother and stepsister. So we have, through them, up in Vermont, and the families came from Connecticut. I can safely say that we're probably all cousins. And I found, and to share with you, I looked to see if I could be a member, and I do have immigrant ancestors. Roger Newton came over to Cambridge and then on to Connecticut, and Thomas Dimmick came over and was among the founders of Barnstable. And in turn, my ancestors from Connecticut were in the Revolution, in Sheldon's Dragoons in Connecticut, and the militias in Vermont. So I thought I was in pretty good shape.
Double member.
I figured I was on good shape until I got to the morals clause. And I knew I was in trouble. But, you know, the family history is, and this is, you know, family troubles started early with the Newtons. That Roger Newton, my immigrant ancestor, entered Cambridge University in 1636, came over in 1638, and was among those first students at the College of Harvard. Graduated from Harvard, preparation for the ministry, and then he ran off to Connecticut and married a hooker. Those of you who have hooker blood, you've had generations of hooker stories. In Connecticut, they made fine art of this. They have the Hooker Day, the Hooker Parade, and the advertisement for hooker beer is quite entertaining. It's "Get caught with a hooker." And I should point out, since my son worked up here for a period of time up at the State House, if you go up there, all the politicians in Massachusetts go through Hookergate. So anyway, Thomas Hooker is another of my connections directly through Roger Newton, who married Mary Hooker, Thomas Hooker's daughter. And Roger went to Connecticut to live in the Hooker household and studied the ministry prepare with Thomas Hooker, and went on to be the first minister in Farmington, was the founder of the congregation in Farmington, and second minister in Milford, Connecticut. So the family started early, and there were those kinds of troubles. There were other things that went on with the family at those early times. But in looking for the trail, I went out, and it wasn't easy to find. But hopefully it'll be easier for you, and I encourage you to go out and do some exploration yourself. Out in Ashford, Connecticut, I came across a marker for the trail that lists 3 of the people who were key in the settlement of Connecticut. John Oldham, who was the first Englishman to go down to Connecticut along the Connecticut Path and was among the founders of Wethersfield. John Wareham was the minister who led his congregation from Dorchester on down the Connecticut Path and were the founders of Windsor. And then, of course, Thomas Hooker and his congregation in 1636 went down to Connecticut from what they called Newtown, but was later became Cambridge. And in doing this, I was initially chasing down Thomas Hooker and my connection to Thomas Hooker through Roger Newton and Mary Hooker. And I found that if you have one relative down there, you're going to have a bunch of relatives down there in the ancestors. That there were 4 in Hartford. I found 10 of the founders in Windsor and a couple over in Wethersfield. And they all had lots of children. So that's why I can say pretty safely that we're all related. We're all cousins. I had to fill in a lot of gaps in my knowledge of this time. And Thomas Hooker was one of the key people in the founding of Connecticut and Hartford. So I had to really kind of school myself on what was happening in his life and the times that they were in that brought them from England to Connecticut. As you look at the bio on Hooker, you find that he was a scholar at Cambridge University, a minister in England and here. Some degree of credit given as a reformer, although within Puritanism, reforming is a little bit different than maybe what we would sense. We have to understand the time. And then he was a founder of Hartford, and also something that I came across with the New England Confederation. Hooker, when he went down to Connecticut, didn't just stay there. He was coming back and forth, and he was a valued counselor here in Massachusetts. And one of the things that came out of that was the help in the formation of the New England Confederation, which was a precursor to colonies working together and joining together for mutual benefit. Statesman, and some would say father of American democracy. So that's a big thing that I didn't know a lot about before I got into this. His journey really began to America in Chelmsford, where he was a lecturer at the St. Mary's Church, and there's a plaque there still honoring his presence. And Hooker was a powerful, dynamic speaker, and it was said of him by his peers that no one equaled him in being able to bring Scripture into practical terms for people's living. And certainly as a Puritan minister, he was espousing beliefs that ran contrary to the established church in England and drawing growing crowds and attention. During that time, one of the places I have to go visit with my wife Gail is we will have to go visit the Cuckoo's Farm, just outside Chelmsford, where the Hooker family lived during this time. The significance of this place in our history, I found, was that not just that the Hooker family lived there, but the ministers from all around the countryside came to the Cuckoo's Farm to meet and discuss matters of Scripture. But since Scripture and government and religion ran close together, they were talking about the corrections to the church in England and the form of government that would accommodate those changes. So it was a place of the inception of ideas of a reform in government that they hoped to accomplish in England. They were up against a powerful set of forces, and the king proclaimed, basically in modern terms, it's my way or it's the highway. that you go along with and belong with the church. If you disagree, then there will be severe consequences. And his appointed assistant was Archbishop William Laud, who we all have a connection to in that our children, or we are descendants of those who came as part of the Laudian migration. That Laud became the Archbishop of London, and he rose through the ranks to be the Archbishop of London. And he affected the repression of the Puritans. And when I learned more about this, there were secret police, there were star chambers, there was no habeas corpus. One of my ancestors, I found, John Wareham, who came over the year after Thomas Hooker and went down to Barnstable, was a minister in London, and the congregation had to meet in secret. They were raided by the police, and 42 of the members were convicted of heresy and confined at the Newgate prison. The minister, Wareham, was there 2 years, 10 months for heresy. And it was determined that he was too dangerous to be released in England. So these are the tenor of the times that they were in, that difference of opinion wasn't something that was lightly tolerated. Your life was at great risk if you went against Archbishop Laud and the English Church. Now, Hooker was driven to exile because he was called to a special commission. And he had powerful friends who said, leave, go to Holland, get out of the country, we'll take care of your family. When Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, it went from a belief that maybe we can change things in England to there's not going to be change in England. And that's when the Great Migration to New England really picked up in 1633. And among the first group coming over was Thomas Hooker. But before he left England, he gave a sermon where he said, there will be a civil war. There were conditions that weren't just religious, there were political, economic conditions that were brewing to a point that later did erupt in the English Civil War. And it was a brutal war, a conflict that at the end of it, King Charles was executed and Archbishop Laud was executed. So when you think of where our ancestors came out of, the conditions that brought them here, they were coming out of a repressive environment that exploded shortly after they left. And if I might add, it just really pointed to the fact that the king was overthrown by the people. Their journey here, and we all share this, is that we're fortunate we have the Mayflower that you can see down here, but they came on ships like the Mayflower. About 200 were on the Griffin that came over with Thomas Hooker, and that was about a 2-month journey, and theirs was in the summer. And I can only say the accommodations, if you go to the Mayflower and you think 200 people crammed below deck, is pretty horrendous conditions to endure. The only thing that would have been worse would be if they had a winter journey. Winter on the North Atlantic. I've been on short ferry rides that have made me queasy. It's hard to think of. They arrived in 1633 in a planned community that was called Newtown. Newtown was built with the idea that it would become the capital of Massachusetts. And the folks over here across the river had different ideas, and so we're sitting on the city on the hill here that John Winthrop formed in Boston. Well, they stayed there from 1633 to 1636, and you say, well, gee, here's a comfortable community. They had good land and homes. Why, as a group, would they pack up and leave? Shortly after they arrived, there were conflicts in their belief about government and what the purpose of their being a community was. And they started looking up in the Merrimack Valley and out west, and they determined through some exploration and sending some pioneering groups out that Connecticut was the place that they needed to be as a congregation. And so in 1636, May 30, Governor Winthrop recorded that Mr. Hooker and his congregation went off to Connecticut. And if you go up to the common across from Harvard Yard, on the corner there's a marker that said Mr. Hooker and his congregation left from here. And it was about a 2-week journey that they took, and I believe that they drank the milk and walked with the cows, 160 cows. Oops, I don't know why that's doing it. That it would be a slow journey in walking across to Connecticut. There were no roads, so they were on native paths. One piece of lore on this that I came across is that Susanna Hooker was carried down to Connecticut on a horse litter. And they said, well, she was an invalid. Poor Susanna Hooker. And then digging into this and trying to understand what was going on, because it wasn't just the men who were going down to Connecticut, it was the whole family, including grandparents and young children. And Susanna Hooker, shortly after they arrived in 1633, she had a son. So if you can imagine being on a boat for 2 months, being pregnant, there are a few of you who could empathize with that. Gentlemen, well, we'll give you the empathy belt here for that. But it was a hard journey. So she had a young child, almost 3 years old, and they had a total of three children who were under 6 years of age. So I think in looking at this that while Susanna Hooker was traveling, she might have had some resistance going on and saying, now that we're settled here and it's comfortable in Cambridge, you want me to walk to Connecticut? So I think maybe for family harmony there was some arrangement to give her a little help with the young children. And my ancestor, Mary Hooker, was the lore of the family is that she walked beside her mother, helping to care for the younger children. But their walk to Connecticut wasn't the completion of their journey. Within 2 years, the congregations from Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield, the freemen of the town, met in Hartford at the meeting house. And Thomas Hooker gave one of his lectures that was based on a passage from Deuteronomy, which was based upon the idea that choose you wise leaders. Because their task was to establish a government that they would give authority to. And the first piece, there were 3 pieces that he included in his lecture. The first was that the choice of the public magistrates belongs to the people. It's the people who must rule. And he explained that this was a God-given gift directly to the people to choose their leaders. And the privileges of election, this is what the privileges of election belong to the people, therefore they must not be exercised according to their humors, but what's the will of God. That they have to choose, not for their own gain, but for the good of all, and the good of the congregation. Translating humors to our times, I think, if Thomas Hooker were here among us today, he'd say something like special interest groups, PACs, extremist websites on both spectrums that have lost sight of what's the good of the congregation. And the last thing that was critical that he brought out in his lecture to the freemen who were going to establish the government was the power to appoint officers belongs to the people, and they can limit that authority. They can remove people from office. That leaders need to serve the people, and when they don't, they be removed. These were in common parlance. Doing the research on this was discussion that was going on at the time. but Hooker connected it to, this is God's gift to you. So that the freemen of Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield in January 1639 adopted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is the first constitution, first written constitution, and was unique in several respects that started us, I think, on a path towards the American Revolution. It established in the preamble, which echoed the words of Thomas Hooker, that formation of the government was with a divine purpose, that it was a gift from God, and that there was a transfer of authority that came directly from God to the people. And the orders themselves were clearly written by a lawyer, and it was most likely Roger Ludlow from Windsor, that really established and delineated the rule of the people, the protections of individual rights, the limitations on the authority and terms and power of those who were chosen as leaders, and the fact that it was ratified by the freemen of the towns. So we have a government that was established here in the wilderness of Connecticut that nowhere in it mentions the king and his authority. All the other colonies had charters establishing their government that granted them power from the king. And here, for the first time, we have power given to the government by the people, based on the gift from their God. And as we look at these, as I started looking at these, it's a lineal descent there from the work that they adopted to the Declaration of Independence, the preamble there period, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. That our sense of what America is and our government didn't happen overnight. But it seems in looking at this that a first step clearly occurred here with a government established by the people with limits on the authority and the power of the officials. So I do believe, I didn't go into this thinking, gosh, that I find what I think might be a key point in the start of the American Revolution. So in learning to discover a little bit about what drove them, then I had to figure out, well, how did they get there? Because it was a journey. And as one who's traveled across the country, there are places that you can travel, the Oregon Trail, the route of Lewis and Clark, that are part of our national history. And when I went to look, there really didn't seem to be any kind of knowledge or history of the Connecticut Path, and finding the way of our ancestors from what's now Cambridge and the Common opposite Hartford down to Connecticut, to Hartford and Windsor and Wethersfield. There were these visions that I came across of early visions and histories that they just set out, compass in hand through the wilderness. It wasn't like that at all. I tried that. It doesn't work, believe me. I spent a lot of time wandering back and forth in the woods. It doesn't work. And then there's also this kind of romantic view of it was like a long-term picnic, walk in the park. And it really was a challenge that was not understood. I hope that I find someone in the historical community that would say, here it is. And I did come across the Connecticut Historic Commission saying, we looked at all this, and there's no evidence that there ever was a path. Sort of like the people just were transported from Cambridge to Connecticut, and they didn't want to get into how they got there, because there was no evidence that they got there. But one of the things I did find as I went out, and you'll have the opportunity if you choose to go out and explore, is that this has been a topic over time, over the past century, that has been of interest to people who were among the early settlers across Massachusetts and Connecticut. And they managed to have a whole bunch of signs put up saying, here are places along the path from Cambridge on down to Hartford that give us some notion that this is where people, by their oral tradition and their family stories, believe that the Thomas Hooker congregation and those other congregations that went down to Connecticut followed. And they followed a network of Indian trails. There was no highway, there was no mass turnpike in Route 84. At lunch today I said, gee, now we hop in the car, and if we drive at or a little under the speed limit, it's 2 hours to get to Connecticut, to Hartford. Their journey was 2 weeks. Our sense of time has been really altered, but they followed a network of native paths and likely had native guides to show them the way, because they were English people who would have been lost in the woods in the trackless wilderness without a guide. A little bit later, John Eliot, who was minister over here in Roxbury, established a series of praying villages along the route of the path that give us some idea of the location that Harold Ayers in the 1930s and 1940s published as a likely route of the Old Connecticut Path. And using that as a guide, I'll give you a real quick tour here. We'll just take a look at some pictures in a moment. On day one from Cambridge, you folks are all from around here, so you know the kind of mentality we have here in Massachusetts around Beacon Hill. About Route 128, in that area at 1636, that was the edge of civilization.
My mother says the Midwest starts in Dedham.
Well, we know today that if you live beyond Route 128, even the weather people, they say, well, then maybe they've extended it beyond 495. But to go to Weston, onto Framingham, and if you do travel the Pike, there's one sign, Old Connecticut Path is one of the roads that you'll pass that's approximately the line of the path. On to Hopkinton, down to Sutton. And then from there to Webster, Woodstock, down to Ashford in Connecticut, and across the Willimantic River. I'm going real fast, you'll get the tour, you go out to the website, to the Willimantic, probably down around the area of Vernon, and then finally down to the river at Hartford. And there were branches going off to Windsor and down to Wethersfield. So that in that 3-year period, 1633, 1636, the three towns were being initially settled and with overland travel. And this would likely have been one of the earliest examples of westward expansion and migration in America. One of the things I found, and I found this up at the American Antiquarian Society up in Worcester, tucked inside a book called The History of Windham County, is a treasure map of the ancient Windham County. And it doesn't have roads, it has Indian trails. And it was published in 1874 by Ellen Martin. And in your brochure, you have a copy of this. And there's a list of some places along the path that go along with these numbers and letters. If you go to the website, these are places that you can go and walk or visit. So you get some sense of what it's like on the ground. But I'm going to give you a couple minutes of commentary while you watch some pictures here. I'll try to move out of the way here. Really the best place to get a sense of what the wilderness could have been like that they traveled through and some of what's there today is roughly between Sutton, Massachusetts, and on down to the Willimantic River. And I can set the clicker down because I'm going to show you some pictures along the way. And you can go out to the website and take some video tours. Here we start at Nanchog Pond, which was the site of one of the praying villages established by John Eliot. And from Nanchog Pond is about a 3-mile wilderness that's uncrossed by a road. That there are traces of the old routes that were followed. Beavers were one of the factors there, of foundations, fireplaces, lodges that were along in the woods. And this is one of the places right here, no more than an hour away from us today, that you can go and walk into the woods and have this quiet of the wilderness. And walk down roadways that have been in use for hundreds of years and are now largely forgotten. It leads out to Webster, and I left the dragon in there. I don't think that was there at that time.
Or the railroad bridge.
Or the railroad bridge. That was near the crossing of the French River. And then on down through Dudley. And then we enter into, entering into Thompson, Connecticut, where the wilderness really picks up a little farther. In the woods here, you can follow old paths that have been in use over hundreds of years. And I found with places like this and little bridges and streams that have crossed, leading down to the Quinnebog River. They cross the river in about that area, and we have to think about trying to travel without bridges present. In Woodstock is a wonderful area to explore for its natural beauty now, and the historic significance there. The Woodstock Historical Society runs a walk along the path from time to time in October, leading along the National Historic Register place of the Old Connecticut Path, over the Westford Hills, and across a portion that dates to the earliest days of settlement in Woodstock. And then west from there, on to Crystal Pond in Eastford. And as you see, this is remarkably wild natural lands that are still there along the rooted path. So it's possible today to go to some of the places that I've outlined here on your map and have a moment of time of experience for yourselves directly to get a sense of what that world could have been like. Now, one of the other people that was key in helping to put the piece together, there were two of the brothers, David and Charles Chisholm. David Chisholm was an Ashford resident, grew up there. And his family went back about 6 generations. So they got the old stories of who came and who lived where. Early in 1930 or earlier, David mapped, based on the local stories, where the Old Connecticut Path crossed. And I set out to follow that, and you know what? It works. And one of the places that Charles Chisholm described, because they lived right up the road, was that in the 1870s they walked to a one-room schoolhouse down the road from them and crossed the Bigelow Brook on the bridge. And the bridge is no longer there. You can walk down through the state forest and Yale Forest, which is a wonderful walk. But he said it wasn't the bridge so much that they crossed. They really remembered crossing Bigelow Brook, which is a lot bigger than a brook, on this set of stones that were lined one to another. And right here you see one of the stones remaining. And he said, you know, the tradition they had was that the stones were there in the place where the Hooker party crossed on the Connecticut Path. Now the stones, we have one of them left there. Harold Ayers, who wrote about this, went back after the flood of 1938. He walked across it in 1935. Flood of the hurricane of 1938, the flood washed the stones away, except for that one remaining. And just a short distance up the hill is the homestead of the Chisholms on Pine Hill at the Chisholm Farm. And Ayers said, Chisholm said, it was a place in local history where the Baptist meetings were held out in the open-air meetings in the early 1900s. And it was also the place that, according to Ellen Larned, was where the Hooker party camped, up and back of their farm on Pine Hill. And if you go on a driving tour between Eastford and Westford that you can do from the website, and you look up the hill at Pine Hill, you can look up from the modern road towards the top of Pine Hill. And I don't recommend jumping out and climbing the hill right now. It's a little rough walk. But at the top of the hill, there's an ancient roadway, right where the Old Connecticut Path was described as crossing. And Chisholm said there was a place on their land that had never been plowed. That was where the path crossed. Now, I'm going to move you real quickly here across to wrap this. I have to figure that, you know, they camped up there at Pine Hill And that would have been about 7 days on the trail. Their 8th day took them across Ashford, across Wellington, down to the Willimantic River. And I've been there, and I got to tell you, it's challenging because it's still wild. Much of it is state forest now or conservation land. It would have been a challenging walk, but one that followed the best lay of the land. One of the things that I found was, why did they go up on all these hills? You know, the highway's down below there. It would have been easy to just follow where the main highway was. We got to remember they didn't have bridges, and there were no roads, and they weren't driving wagons. They were walking. And up there in Ashford last December, down at Route 44, the top picture shows the Mount Hope River at Ashford. And just 3 miles upstream, look what happens to the river. It becomes a stream that you can step across. So the Indian trails that I've found, and this seems to match with the native lore, is that they would follow literally the highway across the hills because the stream crossings would be easier. And for a party with children, women, children, old and young going out, you want the safest way to get there. I'm going to let this run while I talk. You can see some of the distance that they travel, some of the places that the path crosses and that's there as natural today. We'd look at it and say, this is a wonderful place. And we had a group in October, we had about 85 people come out for a walk along the trail in this area. But you have to pull yourself back and say, if you were traveling to Connecticut with this group, and you were sleeping on the ground each night, your meals were basically a kind of corn porridge with bits of salt pork mixed in. That you might have had some food that you would trade with the natives, but it would be a hard journey without any other shelters, perhaps a tent at most. So you say in early June you would hope that they had good weather, otherwise it would be a pretty miserable journey. This would be their 8th day, so I would have to think that their spirits would be just about at the breaking point here, to reach down to, at the end of the day, the crossing of the Willimantic River. And the Willimantic, at low water, you can walk across. If you have a tropical storm or a heavy rain, it would have been challenging. On the 9th day, they likely knew they were on the climb towards the last ridge to leading home, down to the Connecticut Valley, leading up towards Paul-Kell. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a break. I'm going to take you on the Windsor branch of the tour, because the route leading down along to Hartford from Holland and Vernon follows closely to what's now the modern Route 84. And the area there has been very much changed by modern development. But there is a path, a branch of the path that was used to go over to Windsor. And I'll take you on that because John Adams traveled through there, and I found this, that he wrote in his journal, he said, today I rode through paradise. And you can drive through this today, and it is posted as a driving tour, so that you can go and experience the beauty of the land between Tolland and on down to the Connecticut Valley at Windsor. And we have to remember the changes of 3 centuries plus in the settlement there, that the land has been cleared. But there is a point along the way that you reach the top of the hill near Paul-Kell, that you look down the valley and you can see Hartford. And if they were traveling in their 9th day down the trail, they were looking down the hill to see where they were going. And you arrive, and it really struck me in going on this journey, because I'd spent so much time in the woods, when I reached the point where you have this expansive valley, that they must have been thinking, my God, what have we got ourselves into? And they're walking through all those woods. And then as they come into the valley here, the richness of the Connecticut Valley, thinking, my God, look where we have been delivered to. And as you travel through Ellington and East Windsor and South Windsor, there are strong connections to those early pioneers that, I have to say again, we're probably cousins in one way or another through, because they came east and from the original settlement and formed these towns from Windsor. And leading down to the Bissell Ferry site and across to ancient Windsor. Now I use that as a substitute. I'm working, you will see coming in time, the route on down to Hartford. But if you want to have that experience of going from the highlands and the wilderness into this beautiful land that they finally reached at the end of their 2-week journey, here's the place to go. And I have to think that they must have been struck that they had arrived in the Promised Land, or their Promised Land. So what happened to the story? Because I'm out there doing this and saying, this has got to be a great story. Why isn't anyone telling us? What happened to the story? In looking at my own family and what they did, they continued the tradition of migration. They went up the river to Vermont, and the westward migration, they also went up the Mohawk Valley into the Midwest, and they even continued on to the coast. And each generation, I have to think, was telling their children and their grandchildren about the journey that they took. And it wasn't the journey from England, it was the journey from Connecticut or from Ohio to Nebraska. And it was tempered by the story of the sacrifice that they made and the life that they hoped to realize in their journey. But I also found in this that there was another story that likely got woven into it. That very early on, the folks in Connecticut adopted their shield as a symbol in the early 1640s. And the symbolism of the shield and their emblem, the shield and the vines go back to the symbolism of the tribes of Israel being delivered out of bondage in Egypt. And he who transplanted us still sustains us. The belief that their God brought them out and will sustain them. So there's another story, and I was trying to understand this a little further, and thanks to Google, who knew you could Google scripture? There's a wonderful passage in Deuteronomy that gives some advice on what should we tell our children, which I have to think that was woven into what they told their children. And the words came from Deuteronomy, and I'll paraphrase, your God brought you out of bondage and oppression in Egypt and delivered you to the land promised to your ancestors. And if you obey and uphold God's law, you'll be sustained there forever. Now think of the parallels of the life of those Puritans who came out of oppression in England and the risks they took on crossing of 2 months of the sea and 2 weeks in the wilderness, and then established God's law. Remember, Thomas Hooker said, this is a gift from God. They established a constitution based on the gift from God. So I was struck by the parallel of their belief, and they were quite literal and strong in their belief of direct understanding of Scripture, that they lived this passage. And that story was so powerful, it's powerful today, that got woven into our American story. If if we think about what it is to be part of America, it's this sense that this is a place of promise and that there's a degree of divine blessing upon us. And our need to keep that promise and keep that faith. So as I looked at this, some wonderful pictures out there. We have a reenactment of the Hooker party arriving in Hartford. There's certainly immigrant ancestors who came, and we have to say, you know, I firmly believe they came to fulfill a promise or from Scripture that we look at today and say, yes, they came and created a new way of governing and a new society under God's blessing. And they also passed on that lore to their children. It got carried through the country. But I also have other immigrant ancestors. My grandfather, my mother's father, the Ramseys, came to help build the railroads. My grandmother, she came down from the fields of Quebec. They were immigrants. And I have to think they came because of that promise of America, that story of out of oppression, there's opportunity, and you can belong. We have immigrant ancestors who came from all the other places that may have passed through Ellis Island. And they came because, I firmly believe, because of the story of the promise of America. And particularly here at the Union Club, since they're celebrating 150 years since their founding, we're also this year celebrating the emancipation of those who were brought here against their wills. And that is part of the American story and the American promise. So I truly do believe that as they first experienced when they traveled to Connecticut and established this new order in what had to have been their promised land, that story continues today as the story of America and the story of promise. And it's the story of their sacrifice, but also their faith. And that sustains us still. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to share this with some cousins. I invite you to take a look at what's going on the website. If you want to go out and walk some places that are on the path, if you want to come to some of the programs that are going to be out there on the path, or stay at home and watch a little video, come visit the website, or say hello on Facebook. It's a good thing. A couple of things that I want to give a shout to that the New England Historic Genealogy Society, as part of their Come Home to New England, I'm hoping that we'll be able to arrange for a program in Woodstock, Connecticut, in August as part of their Come Home to New England. It's a wonderful place to visit. There are a couple presentations. If you live a little closer, I'll be out in Hopkinton, in Ashland in April, and there'll be an announcement of the dates and times. And a couple of other historical societies along the way down in Connecticut. So I encourage all of you to take the time to go and explore a piece of your history and your heritage along the Connecticut Path. Thank you.
One quick question.
Sure.
How did they get across the major rivers?
I'll come out and you want me to, I can show a little ankle here. They walked.
In other words, they were shallow enough to take his weight.
Connecticut was interesting that they've been on Route 84 and across the bridge there. There actually was a sandbar there that likely they could drive the cattle across, and they'd have to swim a short distance. The Connecticut, they likely had canoes, the natives helped them to get across, and some ferries. The other rivers, and this is one of those pieces that you say, well, why did they go on this kind of zigzag route? There were no bridges, and the route they followed all the way out to Framingham actually ran between the Sudbury River on one side and the Charles on the other. It's like a landmass. And the crossings of the other rivers, the Blackstone and the Quinnebog and the Willimantic, they were on fording places that if you go at the right time of year, you can walk across them. And I've met people who said, gee, when they were young, their families drove cows across to pastures. One of the things you find, maybe I should have put this in there, although the fly fishermen will probably complain that I'm giving away their fishing holes, that these are places that are great for fly fishing, that you can walk across the river. But you have to do it at the right time of year.
Did Hooker and his congregation, I mean, they were walking this path for the first time, so was it so well marked that they could follow without any issue, or did some people from Wethersfield come up that had done it a few times and help them?
Indian guides?
I think that it was probably, between 1633 when, Olmsted went down, and 1636, there were a number of parties. Some of them were like the adventurers that went and kind of checked their things out.
Right.
And it's likely they also had native guides, because along the way would have been Indian settlements, and they did some trading back and forth to be able to probably buy some coin. One of the things that I also came across in doing this is that we just had Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving actually would not have been possible without the natives, without the Indians. Their corn basically saved the pilgrims. And I found in 1630 it saved the folks who settled here in Boston from starvation. And in 1637, their first year up there in the Connecticut Valley, the corn that was brought down from the upper valley up near Deerfield saved them. We think of pioneers and these folks that were going down. This was all new territory for them. They were used to growing up and living in England where you made roads. They probably never traveled more than 10 miles away from home in their entire life. They were the upcoming kind of middle class, and so they weren't the kind of rough and tumble pioneers. This would have been hard for them. But the river crossings, I think, would have been the most dangerous part of their journey.
Were the Indians hostile at all or not?
We all grew up with that. You remember, it was like Friday night, and we had the wagon train on, and every week, you'd think that they would have learned not to go certain places. They'd all circle the wagons because the Indians are hostile. In the early years, prior to King Philip's War, there actually was trade, and in the earliest years, the natives actually wanted the English to come on down and settle in Connecticut for their mutual protection. Their numbers had been reduced by illness, by things that they had no immunity to. And so there was a degree that, I'm sure their descendants, if we got them in a room and I did this, they'd say, that was the darndest thing they ever could have done. How foolish was that, inviting those English down to our land?
One of my second generation of Emerson was Daniel Emerson, who was a minister, and he actually was in Menlo, and I think the entire town was split. He and his wife and kids were the breakfast of the only ones to escape. And after that, the congregational ministers began to take sides. And Daniels came after that. They were military as well as the
There are some things, and Mendon was among the towns that, as you get into this, there was probably one of the worst wars that America has ever experienced during King Philip's War. That it literally was fought to a point where the English were about ready to pack up and leave. And the Indians were about ready to die of starvation. And there was real atrocities, we have to say, on both sides. That those tribesmen, John Eliot, created the praying villages and converted some of the natives to Christianity. During the King Philip's War, they were herded out to Deer Island in winter without blankets. But it was a change, and many of the early settlements, particularly here in Massachusetts, were raided, and there was much loss of life.
And they were sold into Spanish slavery.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like when I said, there's a black hole in our history. There's a lot there that when you go back and you say, gee, a lot of the things that evolved is our treatment of the natives who lived here for thousands of years came out of that time frame. Yes.
I was going to say, prelude to that also is the Pequot War, which takes place in the late 1630s, so we kind of lost our innocence. I had a question for you about this covenant that Hooker formulates. You present that as a major document in American colonial history, and I'm sure it is. But wasn't there a royal charter in Connecticut eventually?
It came afterwards.
Surely.
Yeah, that came afterwards.
That was the document that was hidden in the oak famously, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Is that Charles II?
Charles II, and that's where we get into later history before the Revolution. That Charles I lost his head, it was said that he acknowledged that his mistake was giving too much power and authority to the Bishop Laud. Calmed the waters a bit, he probably would have kept his head. Charles II, his son, was restored in 1660, and so we went from a period of times where the Puritans were in power to their being once again outcast. And Charles II basically wanted to grab the charters back. Connecticut's charter was renegotiated by John Winthrop the Younger, John Winthrop's son, who would be a whole other chapter telling the story of John Winthrop, who had kept a diary in Latin of his walk in 1642, or 1645. He walked from his house. He said, honey, I'm going off to see my home, see some land down at what would be New London, on foot in November. 28 days later, he made it back to, he walked 280 miles through the wilderness. He missed his turn a couple of times, wound up in Springfield, down to Saybrook, but he was the one who renegotiated the charter. That these characters from time, we don't have a beat on them. We just have to go back and try and get some of, not just the names that would be on a genealogy, but the stories of what was happening in their lives and what was happening in that time.
This is a little off topic. Charles I lost his head. What happened to Archbishop Laud? Same thing.
Yeah. They both, it was, equal justice, I suppose. But even there, we have the benefit of a lot of time in hindsight and saying, there were decisions that were made that weren't good on both sides, but it was a terrible war. But I do think it set the precedence, and when you think of the Patriots overthrowing the king, who were the Patriots? They were the ones whose great-grandparents might have been the families that were in England overthrowing the king, or leaving because of the conditions that some of the people, and this is something else I came across, is that we think of it as a one-way migration. People came from England. During that period of the Civil War, people were going back from New England back to England to help with the revolution, the Civil War, and fighting against the king. So that you start having a better understanding of the history that we think just erupted in 1775, or because of the tea tax. It went back to the very beginning of the conflict and relations.
Was the Connecticut Path named for that one journey, or did people repeat the journey to become a regular route?
I think one of the things those historians had as a problem is that, well, we couldn't find that there was a Connecticut Path. Well, if you think literally, that requires naming it, and the naming came later. They didn't have maps. They were following trails, so they didn't have anything that they could write down or draw a map, because even the later maps were very rough.
They didn't have a GPS.
Yeah, it would have been great. It saved me a lot of stumbling around. There was evolution in travel. If you follow this route, you remember I said up on the highlands there? And stream crossings were easy because there were no bridges. After settlement was occurring, there were two needs. To build bridges, which they had the technology, they understood how to build a longer bridge to span. And they had a need for wheeled transport. And if you think the best place for walking is not necessarily the best place for a roadway. Even though they were traveling across the hills, as a footpath, it was a very sensible, safe way to travel. Building a road on it would have been really difficult. There were some cartways. There are some roads there, but they've been abandoned because there were easier ways to get there. So there was an evolution from the hills down to the valleys of the highways, and also of settlement. We see that those hilltop towns on the ridges were given up over time for settlements down in the valleys. That's part of how I think the whole path may have faded from memory. It just wasn't useful for a long period of time. It was used in the very earliest years. And then once settlement was established, they had a need for a way that would accommodate wheel transport, and that would also take advantage of the fact that they could cross rivers where they were much deeper.
Did maritime, if you were in Boston, late 1600s, early 1700s, did boat transport down and up the Connecticut River ever become more feasible than doing the roads?
A couple things on that. Yes, even in the early years, there was transport around the Cape. There wasn't a canal, and there's a graveyard of ships on the Cape. So it wasn't necessarily the easiest way to get from here to there. There was travel, and I found that, like Wethersfield, right down the street, was an ocean port. They had a trade going out from Wethersfield down the river and out in ocean travel. These first pioneers, I have to think there were probably two factors. First, cost. Loading things on a ship, going around, would have been at a high cost. With the competition at that time, the ships were being used more going back and forth to England. And second, I think, goes back to I told you about Susanna Hooker, that they gave her a horse litter to carry her. Imagine yourselves as English people who've never traveled more than 10 miles away from your home of life, who've just spent 2 months at sea. Do you think you would ever want to get on another boat? I think you'd probably say, boat, walk, I know about walking. It's not going to make me sick. And plus, driving cattle and livestock was a real challenge. It would have been, from their point of view, I think it was the lesser of the evils to just say, okay, we know about walking, we can do this. Well, I want to thank you again. I hope you do take advantage of the opportunity to visit some places along the path and do some exploration along the way. And you'll probably find as you do that you're going to be meeting a whole bunch of your other cousins. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website